Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision. It's almost like engineering.
Right. It's binary.
Exactly. You fall, you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just, points a pen at it and says, there it is. That's the break.
It's totally objective, broken or not broken.
Yeah, it's clean. But then you step into the world of ancient historical chronology and suddenly realize that the x-ray machine itself might be, well, fundamentally broken.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at a timeline landscape that is incredibly murky. It's built on assumptions layered upon 19th century assumptions, which are, in turn layered upon fragmented pieces of pottery.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
Yeah.
But instead of bones, we are dealing with centuries. Entire civilizations are at stake here.
Exactly. So welcome to the Deep Dive Special English Bookcast, everyone. Whether you are prepping for a meeting, catching up on historical debates, or you're just insanely curious like I am, our mission today is to explore a text that promises to completely shatter that murky timeline.
It really does. It takes a sledgehammer to it.
We are looking at a book that challenges the very bedrock of how we date antiquity, revealing that it might just be made of sand. The source book today is Empire of Thebes, or Ages in Chaos Revisited by Emmet Sweeney.
Which is a fantastic read, by the way.
It is. This is volume 3 of his massive Ages in Alignment series, published by Algora Publishing.
And, Emmet Sweeney is a historian who is certainly not afraid to walk into the academic china shop and start swinging. He deals in massive structural revisions of history.
Okay, let's unpack this. The core premise here is fascinating because of the legacy it builds on. Sweeney is picking up the mantle from a very famous, very controversial historical revisionist from the 1950s named Immanuel Velikovsky.
Right, the author of Ages in Chaos.
It's exactly. Velikovsky originally argued that Egyptian history was severely misdated, but Sweeney comes in with a massive twist on his predecessor's work.
He really does.
He argues that Velikovsky, for all his radical and groundbreaking ideas, actually didn't go far enough. Sweeney says Velikovsky failed to finish the chronological reconstruction because he relied way too heavily on the Hebrew Bible as, like, an infallible, perfectly calibrated chronological yardstick.
What's fascinating here is how Sweeney decides to fix that methodological flaw. He proposes a radical, and I mean absolutely radical, shortening of the Egyptian New Kingdom timeline.
How much of a shortening are we talking about?
He suggests shifting the timeline forward by roughly 7 to 8 centuries.
Wow. 800 years.
Yeah, about that. And he does this to finally align Egyptian history with the established histories of classical rayers, the known chronology of Mesopotamia, and the eventual conquest of the region by Alexander the Great.
So it brings everything into sync.
Precisely. By executing this shift, he eliminates a mysterious, highly debated 540-year gap in conventional history.
But if you shift a timeline by 800 years, you aren't just moving dates on a spreadsheet. I mean, you completely change the identities of famous historical and mythical figures.
You really do.
People who we thought lived centuries apart, isolated in their own eras, are suddenly staring at each other across the geopolitical chessboard.
It completely rewrites the map.
So to grasp how this works, let's start with Chapter 1 and the fundamental flaw that creates this massive black hole in history. How does a 540-year gap even happen?
Well, to understand this, we have to look at the mechanics of Middle Eastern archaeology, specifically in places like northern Syria and the Levant.
Okay.
When archaeologists dig through the ruined layers of an ancient city, what they call the strata, they need a way to date those layers. And in the Bronze Age, Egyptian artifacts were the absolute gold standard for dating.
Wait, so just to visualize this for the listener, archaeologists are looking at a cross-section of dirt in an excavation trench, kind of like a layered cake. And they're using these little carved beetle amulets, the Egyptian scarabs or bits of inscribed pottery, as date stamps for each layer.
Precisely. The Egyptians were obsessive record keepers and just, prolific manufacturers of royal propaganda.
Yeah, they branded everything.
They really did. So if you find a scarab belonging to a specific pharaoh in a layer of ash and mud in Syria, you date that layer based on the accepted dates for that pharaoh's reign back in Egypt. It anchors the whole region's chronology.
Makes sense so far. So what breaks?
What breaks is what happens after the reign of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten when the glorious 18th dynasty of Egypt collapses.
Okay, the famous fall.
Right. According to the standard textbook timeline, at this exact moment, the archaeology of northern Syria undergoes a sudden, completely inexplicable change. The dirt layers stop yielding Egyptian artifacts.
Oh, so they lose their date stamps.
Exactly. Therefore, they stop being dated by Egyptology. Instead, archaeologists suddenly jump forward in time, leaving a 540-year gap.
Wait, they just leave a gap?
Yeah, and they start dating the very next layers of dirt based on Assyrian chronology.
Hold on, I have to channel the listener's skepticism here. This sounds perfectly neat when you describe it as a flaw, but we are talking about erasing over 5 centuries of established history.
It's a massive chunk of time.
Right. Surely generations of brilliant archaeologists didn't just forget to look at the dirt layers. What is the conventional explanation for this gap? Like, why do Orthodox historians insist on this dark age in northern Syria?
Well, the Orthodox explanation is that Egypt simply lost its empire. The theory goes that after Akhenaten's disastrous reign, Egypt retreated inward, its foreign influence evaporated, and a massive dark age descended over the entire Levant and Syria.
And that lasted for 500 years.
According to them, yes, until the Neo-Assyrian Empire rose up centuries later to fill the void. Historians point to a lack of monumental building and a cessation of international trade as proof of this dark age.
But what about scientific dating?
They do use it. Early carbon dating often seemed to support these older dates, though carbon dating for this specific historical period, particularly the Bronze to Iron Age transition, is notoriously wobbly.
Wobbly how?
Due to calibration curve plateaus like the Hallstatt plateau, which can yield date ranges spanning centuries, it's just not as precise for this specific window as people think.
So the conventional view is literally Egypt goes home, the lights go out in Syria for 500 years, and then the Assyrians turn them back on.
Exactly. But Sweeney looks at the physical evidence in the ground. He points out that there is no sterile layer of dirt.
Really?
No, there's no half-meter of windblown sand representing 540 years of abandonment. The stratum containing the end of the 18th dynasty artifacts sits immediately adjacent to, or directly beneath, the strata associated with the later Neo-Assyrian Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, the pottery styles evolve seamlessly. There's no biological or geological evidence of a 500-year gap. Sweeney is arguing that these are actually concurrent eras.
So they overlap.
Yes, the Egyptian decline and the Assyrian rise happened at the exact same time, not half a millennium apart.
It's like trying to solve a massive historical jigsaw puzzle, where half the pieces are from a different box. Conventional history says there are 2 separate puzzles, an older Egyptian one and a newer Assyrian one.
Right.
And Sweeney is saying, no, pour them onto the same table. They interlock perfectly to form one single continuous Iron Age picture.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But let's test this. If I shift a meeting on my calendar by an hour, my whole day is chaotic. I'm double booked. I miss lunch.
Oh, for sure.
So if we slide this historical ruler forward by 800 years, where do the hash marks land? Who bumps into who?
This is where Sweeney's meticulous reconstruction really begins to shine. He provides a brilliant, highly specific example.
Let's hear it.
The great Pharaoh Thutmose III and the biblical Pharaoh Shishak.
Okay, Thutmose III is arguably the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. He's the guy who built the massive Egyptian empire, launching campaign after campaign into the Levant.
Yes. In the conventional timeline, Thutmose III lived around 1450 BC. This is centuries before the biblical kings David and Solomon even existed.
Right.
But if you apply Sweeney's chronological shift, Thutmose III is pulled drastically forward in time. Under this revised model, Thutmose III, the greatest of Egyptian conquerors, is suddenly placed as an exact contemporary of Solomon's sons.
You mean King Rehoboam and Jeroboam?
Exactly. King Rehoboam of Judah and King Jeroboam I of Israel.
So he is dragged right into the turbulent 10th century BC.
Exactly. Now consider the biblical record. The Book of Kings tells us that during the 5th year of the reign of Rehoboam, an Egyptian pharaoh named Shishak invaded the divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel with a massive army.
Oh, and he sacked Jerusalem, right?
Yes, carrying off the treasures of the temple.
And Egyptologists have been pulling their hair out trying to find this guy in the standard timeline, haven't they?
For over a century, they usually point to a much later, relatively minor Libyan king of the 22nd dynasty named Shoshenq I.
Shoshenq.
Yay.
Just because it sounds like Shishak.
Pretty much, simply because his name sounds a bit like Shishak. But Shoshenq's own inscriptions don't mention capturing Jerusalem at all. and he didn't possess the immense military apparatus described in the biblical account.
So it's a weak match.
Very weak. His campaigns were basically border raids compared to what Shishak is described as doing.
So the conventional match is incredibly flimsy.
It is. But Sweeney says, stop looking for a minor king to fit a flawed timeline. The man who conquered the Levant with overwhelming imperial force in that era was Thutmose III.
Wow.
Thutmose III is Shishak. The dates, the geographical scope of the campaigns, the massive scale of the conquest, the wealth extracted, it all aligns perfectly.
But only if you shrink the timeline.
Exactly. Only if you shrink the timeline and pull the 18th dynasty forward.
That is incredibly elegant. You solve a biblical mystery and an archaeological missing strata gap with one massive chronological slide.
It's a 2-for-1.
It really is. But, and this is where the dominoes really start to fall. If moving the timeline forward turns Thutmose III into the biblical Shishak, that creates a massive ripple effect backward.
Oh, a huge one.
His immediate predecessor is dragged forward into the exact era of King Solomon himself. And moving to chapter 2, this brings us to the most famous female ruler of the ancient world, Hatshepsut.
The Queen of Thebes. The woman who ruled Egypt as a full pharaoh.
Right. She donned the traditional male regalia, including the false beard, to project absolute authority.
Exactly. Under this new timeline, Hatshepsut is a contemporary of Solomon, and Sweeney introduces a radical identification here. Hatshepsut isn't just a powerful Egyptian pharaoh.
Who is she?
She is the literal historical figure behind the legendary, almost mythical Queen of Sheba.
That is a breathtaking claim. But when we examine the specific evidence Sweeney marshals, it is remarkably compelling. Let's start with the biblical text itself.
All right, let's do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, Jesus refers back to the Queen of Sheba, but he gives her a very specific geopolitical title. He calls her the Queen of the South.
And from the perspective of a Judean in Jerusalem, looking at the geopolitical map, the ultimate undisputed power of the South is always Egypt.
Always.
It's not a scattered nomadic tribe in the Arabian desert. It's the breadbasket of the ancient world.
Precisely. But Sweeney doesn't just rely on biblical inference, right? He relies heavily on classical historians to bridge the gap between mythology and history.
He does. He points out that Flavius Josephus, the incredibly important first-century Jewish historian, explicitly described the Queen of Sheba.
And Josephus had access to records and traditions that are now totally lost to us.
Exactly. And Josephus did not say she came from the Arabian Peninsula. Josephus wrote that she was the ruler of both Egypt and Ethiopia.
That is a massive detail that Orthodox history just completely ignores.
It gets ignored because it is wildly inconvenient. It simply doesn't fit the conventional 10th century timeline where Egypt was supposedly weak, fragmented, and incapable of producing a queen of such legendary wealth and diplomatic reach.
Right.
Furthermore, Sweeney looks at the linguistic traditions of the region. In the Keber Nagast, the ancient Ethiopian national epic, the Queen of Sheba has a specific, revered name, Makeda.
Okay, Makeda.
Sweeney notes the intense phonetic resemblance between the Ethiopian name Makeda and Hatshepsut's official formal throne name in Egypt, which was Makeda.
Makeda and Makera. You can easily see how a D and an R sound transcribe across different linguistic groups over a few centuries.
It's a very common phonetic shift.
But we have to address the geography because Orthodox Egyptologists would immediately bring up the land of Punt.
Ah, yes, Punt.
Hatshepsut is famous for launching this massive, unprecedented naval and overland expedition to a mysterious, wealthy land called Punt. She was so proud of it that she carved the entire narrative in exquisite detail into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari.
It's a stunning piece of history.
Conventional history insists Punt was located in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia down the Red Sea coast. Does Sweeney agree with that geographical placement?
He vehemently disagrees, and he bases this on hard archaeological logic.
Okay, what's his argument?
The critics of Velikovsky and Sweeney insist Punt was in Eritrea or Somalia because the Egyptian reliefs show the expedition bringing back myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, and exotic animals like baboons.
Which all sound African.
Right. But Sweeney points out a glaring anomaly. If you look at the incredibly detailed reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, the people of Punt are not depicted as scattered, nomadic pastoralists.
How are they depicted?
They're shown as having a highly structured society. They have advanced architecture. They possess manufactured metal weapons. They have an organized, wealthy monarchy.
And let me guess, the archaeology of Eritrea and Somalia doesn't match that picture at all.
Not even close. Whether you date the 18th dynasty to 1500 BC, the conventional date, or 1000 BC, the revised date there is absolutely zero archaeological evidence of an advanced, literate, metalworking, urbanized civilization located in Eritrea or Somalia during those periods.
Wow.
There are no ruined cities for the Egyptians to have traded with on that massive state-sponsored scale.
You can't have a multi-million-dollar international trade summit with a civilization that literally doesn't leave a footprint in the dirt.
Exactly.
So where does Sweeney put punt?
Sweeney argues that ancient authors and geographical clues point to the region of Sheba as being the ancient capital of Nubia and the lands immediately south of Egypt, encompassing parts of modern Sudan and northern Ethiopia.
So closer to home.
Yes. The people of Punt depicted in the Egyptian reliefs share the exact same ethnic and cultural characteristics as the people of the Upper Nile and Nubia. Therefore, Hatshepsut's legendary expedition to Punt was actually a massive mission to consolidate the southern regions of her own sphere of influence. The extremely wealthy, gold-rich lands historically associated with Sheba.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want you, the listener, to pause and visualize the implications of this for a second. We all know the Sunday school story of King Solomon, sitting in his incredibly wealthy, newly built capital in Jerusalem, receiving a state visit from the exotic queen of Sheba.
Right, arriving with camels bearing spices and gold.
Exactly. But if Sweeney is right, instead of a relatively obscure queen from an unknown Arabian kingdom, it's Hatshepsut.
Yes.
It is the most powerful woman on the face of the planet, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And she is a woman who famously bent every gender norm of her era, wearing masculine clothing and a false beard to assert her absolute dominance in a patriarchal world.
It's an incredible image.
Imagine that diplomatic summit. Solomon, the rising star of the Levant, meeting Hatshepsut, the established superpower of the Nile. It completely rewrites the political gravity of the biblical story.
It certainly does. It elevates the narrative from a quaint, almost fairy tale legend of a wealthy visitor to a high-stakes, tense geopolitical summit between the two most dominant superpowers of the Iron Age.
It's wild.
And it demonstrates Sweeney's core thesis. History is an interconnected web. When you correct the placement of one major piece like Egypt, it forces a cascade of re-identifications across the entire map of the ancient world.
Which flows perfectly into Chapter 3 of the source.
Yeah.
Because we have to look at what happens when that alliance falls apart.
Right, things change quickly.
After Hatshepsut's long, relatively peaceful and glorious reign ends, her stepson, Thutmose III, finally steps out of her shadow and rules on his own. And he spends his reign aggressively conquering the north.
He was relentless.
Reading through Sweeney's account of these campaigns into Palestine and Canaan, he makes some incredible linguistic leaps that tie Egyptian records directly to Hebrew geography. Let's dig into that.
The linguistic evidence is a critical pillar of Sweeney's reconstruction. When Thutmose III meticulously recorded his massive conquest to the north, carving the lists of conquered cities into the walls of the Temple of Karnak, he referred to the entire territory he subdued as Rechenu, or, depending on the transliteration, Rezenu.
Okay, Regina.
Sweeney points out that this Egyptian term is practically etymologically identical to the Hebrew name for the land of Israel, which is Arzenu.
Arzinu, which translates to our land in Hebrew.
Exactly. So the Egyptian military records are literally stating that they conquered our land, utilizing the indigenous Semitic term for the territory. It's a direct phonetic match.
That's fascinating.
But Sweeney gets even more granular when we look at the specific capital city that Thutmose III sacked after his famous victory at the Battle of Megiddo.
Right. So Thutmose wins at Megiddo, which secures his hold on the region, and then he marches on a major capital city to loot its wealth. What is the linguistic connection there?
Well, the Egyptian annals record that Thutmose III sacked a spectacularly wealthy city called Kadesh.
Kadesh, okay.
Now, Orthodox historians usually try to locate this Kadesh somewhere in modern Syria, often identifying it with a site on the Orontes River. But Sweeney argues this makes no sense geographically or strategically for this specific campaign.
So what does Kadesh mean?
He looks at the meaning of the word. Kadesh simply means the holy place or the holy city in Semitic languages.
And what is the ultimate holy city in that region?
Jerusalem. Sweeney explains that Jerusalem is known throughout biblical texts as the holy mountain, the holy city. Even today, in modern Arabic, Jerusalem is known as Al-Quds, which derives from the exact same Semitic root meaning holy.
Wow.
Therefore, when Thutmose III proudly records that he sacked the great temple of Kadesh, stripping it of immense treasures, including specific gold and silver vessels, shields, and doors.
He is describing the exact same historical event as the biblical account of Pharaoh Shishak looting the newly built Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem.
Exactly.
It's the same event, documented from two different geopolitical perspectives. The Egyptians write, "We sacked Kadesh," and the Hebrews write, "Shishak looted Jerusalem."
Precisely. And it explains the sheer volume of wealth Thutmose III brought back to Egypt.
Because the Temple of Solomon was famous for its gold.
Yes. If Thutmose looted a minor Syrian outpost, the math on the booty just doesn't add up. If he looted Solomon's Jerusalem, it perfectly explains the sudden explosion of wealth in the Egyptian New Kingdom.
And the source gives us some incredibly vivid human details to back this up. First, there's the internal family drama back in Egypt. When Thutmose III took over, he didn't just ignore Hatshepsut's legacy. He actively sought to destroy it.
Yes, he enacted a ruthless campaign of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory.
Let's explain that for the listener, because it's such a fascinating psychological concept. It wasn't just about disliking her.
No, it was systematic.
He sent stonemasons to every temple in Egypt to physically chisel her name off the walls, to smash her statues, to meticulously erase her very existence from the historical record.
Total erasure.
Now, if Sweeney is right, and Hatshepsut was the Queen of Sheba, who had formed a massive, defining alliance with King Solomon, then Thutmose III's subsequent invasion of Solomon's son's kingdom takes on a whole new layer of vindictive political revenge.
It really does.
He isn't just seeking gold. He is systematically dismantling his hated stepmother's entire geopolitical legacy. He's destroying her international alliances. At the same time, he is destroying her statues at home. It makes the history so incredibly visceral.
It transforms abstract dates into human political maneuvering. It provides a motive for the invasion of Judah that goes beyond mere plunder.
And speaking of visceral details, there's another piece of evidence Sweeney brings up that I absolutely love because it relies on biology, not just texts.
Oh, the elephant hunt.
Yes, the anecdote from the soldier Immanuel. It is a fantastic, undeniable piece of ecological evidence.
It really is.
So we have an Egyptian military official named Immanuel who served under Thutmose III. He actually wrote an autobiography detailing his service. And he writes this incredible specific story about how during one of these northern campaigns in Syria, the Egyptian army encountered a massive localized herd of elephants.
Yeah.
He boasts that the army hunted over 100 of them and that he actually saved Thutmose III from a charging bull elephant. It's a great story, but why does Sweeney highlight this specific ecological detail?
Because the presence of a massive herd of Syrian elephants represents a severe chronological anomaly for the conventional timeline.
Oh, so?
According to modern paleontology and environmental archaeology, if Thutmose III lived in the 15th century BC, the Bronze Age, there shouldn't have been massive, huntable herds of elephants in that specific region of northern Syria.
They were gone.
Yes. The climate and human encroachment had largely driven them to extinction in that area by that time.
So the environment literally doesn't match the date.
Right. However, if you apply the chronological shift and move Thutmose III forward to the 10th or 9th century BC, the Iron Age, the anomaly vanishes. Because we have extensive independent records from Assyrian kings of that exact later era, kings like Tiglath-Pileser I and Shalmaneser III, who also explicitly boast in their annals about hunting large herds of elephants in that exact same Syrian region near the Orontes River.
So the elephants act as a biological timestamp.
Exactly.
They prove that Thutmose III was walking the earth at the same time as the later Assyrian kings because they were hunting the exact same herds, not separated by 500 years of extinction.
Precisely. It is an ecological detail that stubbornly contradicts the established chronology. The elephants don't lie.
No, they don't.
And if we connect this localized evidence to the broader cultural picture, it explains a major lingering mystery in classical literature regarding the Greeks.
Oh, the Sesostris myth.
Yes. The ancient Greek historians, like Herodotus, wrote extensively about a legendary, world-conquering Egyptian pharaoh whom they called Sesostris. They dedicated pages and pages to his exploits, his conquests in Asia, his massive monuments.
Right, but modern Orthodox Egyptologists could never find a single pharaoh Sesostris in the ground who actually accomplished all those things at the right time.
He was essentially a ghost in the archaeological record, a myth.
Because he isn't one single person.
Exactly. Sweeney explains that because the conventional timeline was artificially stretched out over centuries, The Greeks, who were writing much later, compressed the fading cultural memories of several real, distinct Egyptian conquerors, primarily Thutmose III and perhaps later Ramses II, into a single legendary archetype they named Sesostris.
That makes so much sense.
By fixing the timeline, Sweeney unpacks the myth and assigns the actual historical deeds back to Thutmose III.
It's incredible how shifting the timeline operates like a master key, unlocking these historical riddles one by one.
It's very satisfying.
Okay, let's move forward in the chronology, which brings us to chapter 4 of the book. This section deals with one of the most famous and important archaeological troves ever discovered, the Amarna letters.
The Amarna letters represent the ultimate diplomatic archive of the ancient world. They were discovered in the late 19th century in the ruins of Akhetaten, the short-lived capital city built by the heretic Pharaoh Akhenaten.
Just to set the stage for our listeners, these aren't papyrus scrolls. These are hundreds of baked clay tablets containing actual day-to-day diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs, primarily Amenhotep III, and his son Akhenaten, and various kings, warlords, mayors, and vassals scattered across the Middle East.
And under the standard textbook timeline, these letters are firmly dated to the 14th century BC, deep in the Bronze Age.
Right. So how does Sweeney completely upend our reading of them?
Sweeney argues that if you read the Amarna letters objectively, ignoring the preconceived dates assigned to them, the political, military, and cultural landscape they describe does not match the 14th century Bronze Age at all.
Not at all.
No. Instead, it perfectly matches the highly fragmented, volatile Iron Age era of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah and the looming, rising threat of the Assyrian Empire to the north.
And he starts with the linguistics again, right?
Yes. The letters are primarily written in Akkadian cuneiform. Akkadian was the lingua franca, the diplomatic language of the day, much like English is today.
So a Canaanite mayor writing to an Egyptian pharaoh uses a Mesopotamian language.
Exactly. But Sweeney highlights a crucial detail noticed by linguists. These Akkadian texts from the Levantine vassals are heavily peppered with Hebrew terms, Hebrew syntax, and Hebrew idioms mixed directly into the phrasing.
Wow.
The local scribes in Canaan were essentially translating Hebrew thought patterns into Akkadian cuneiform on the fly.
Which makes absolutely perfect sense if the letters were written during the era of the Israelite kingdoms. But it makes very little sense if they were written centuries before the Israelites supposedly arrived or coalesced as a distinct culture, which is what the Orthodox timeline claims.
Precisely. The language reflects an established Hebrew presence, and then Sweeney analyzes the specific characters mentioned in the letters.
Right, these aren't just generic tribal leaders.
Not at all. You have figures like Labayu, a highly aggressive warlord operating out of the central hills near Shechem, who is constantly harassing his neighbors, expanding his territory, and writing utterly defiant, sarcastic letters to the pharaoh.
Sarcastic diplomatic letters. I love that.
Yeah, and Sweeney, building on Velikovsky's earlier work, identifies this Labayu with a prominent, aggressive Israelite king of the northern kingdom, someone akin to King Ahab or another ruler from the powerful Amrite dynasty.
The geography of where he operates and his political attitude matches perfectly.
Then you have Aziru, a powerful leader in the region of Syria, who is playing a brilliant, cunning double game, balancing alliances between Egypt and the rising northern empire of Hatti.
In reading Sweeney, he identifies Aziru as the biblical king Hadadezer of Aram Zobah, right?
Yes. Hadadezer was a major Syrian adversary who fought against the Israelites. The Amarna letters describe a complex web of shifting alliances, mercenary raids by groups called the Habiru, and desperate pleas from local mayors to Egypt for military support.
It sounds chaotic.
It was. And Sweeney demonstrates that this chaos mirrors the exact geopolitical reality of the 9th and 8th centuries BC described in the biblical Book of Kings, not the relatively stable, Egyptian-dominated pre-Israelite Canaan of the 14th century.
Okay, but I have to stop you here and challenge this model because I noticed a massive potential contradiction in the source material.
Oh, let's hear it.
Sweeney points out that one of the most prolific letter writers in the entire Amarna cache is a man named Abdikiba. And Abdikiba is the ruler of Jerusalem.
Right.
He is writing directly to the pharaoh, commanding troops, requesting archers, and clearly operating as a major literate regional power broker. But under the standard 14th century timeline, pre-Davidic Jerusalem was supposed to be nothing more than a tiny, insignificant Jebusite fortress clinging to a ridge.
That's the conventional view, yes.
Well, it wasn't a major power yet. The archaeology of Bronze Age Jerusalem shows almost nothing. How does Sweeney reconcile this glaring contradiction between the text and the dirt?
You've hit on one of the strongest, most elegant arguments for the entire revision. Under the conventional timeline, Orthodox historians are stuck with an unresolvable contradiction.
Right.
The Amarna letters prove Jerusalem was a major literate diplomatic hub, but the Bronze Age archaeology of Jerusalem shows a near-empty hill. They don't match, and scholars write endless papers trying to explain why the city just vanished.
That's a huge problem for them.
But under Sweeney's revised timeline, the contradiction evaporates. Why? Because the Amarna period is shifted forward by 500 years. This isn't the pre-Davidic Jebusite fortress.
So Abdihiva is reeling a much later version of Jerusalem.
Yes. Under the revised timeline, Abdihiba is a king of Judah ruling from Jerusalem during the divided monarchy era, perhaps a king like Jehoshaphat or Jehoram.
Oh, wow.
This perfectly explains why Jerusalem is suddenly projecting regional prominence in the letters. It is the established, wealthy, heavily fortified capital city of an Iron Age kingdom. The extensive archaeology of Iron Age Jerusalem matches the political importance of Abdihiba in the letters perfectly.
The timeline shift solves the contradiction by aligning the text with the correct stratum of dirt.
Exactly.
That is the ultimate aha moment. It just clicks. The puzzle pieces finally fit. But things are about to get incredibly dark for Egypt. This brings us to chapter 5 of the book, which is easily the most dramatic, cinematic part of this entire deep dive.
It really is a tragedy.
We are talking about the fall of Thebes, a literal Greek tragedy playing out on the banks of the Nile. We are focusing on the heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten, and the violent, chaotic end of the glorious 18th dynasty.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Velikovsky's genius really shone brightly and where Sweeney significantly expands and hardens the historical framework.
Okay, tell us about it.
Velikovsky proposed a mind-bending theory that the famous Greek myth of Oedipus, the tragic king of Thebes who unwittingly killed his father, married his mother, and brought a devastating plague upon his city, is not just a poetic invention by Sophocles.
Wait, really?
No, it is actually a heavily distorted, culturally transmitted historical record of the tragic life of Pharaoh Akhenaten of Egyptian Thebes.
I was reading this section in the source, and my mind was absolutely racing. The parallels are just too hyperspecific to be coincidence. Let's unpack the evidence here.
Let's do it.
First, the Greek myth says Oedipus was exiled at birth and raised far away from the royal court. When you look at the historical record, the evidence strongly suggests Akhenaten was largely absent, possibly exiled or hidden away, from the opulent royal court of his father, Amenhotep III, during his early years.
Right. He appears seemingly out of nowhere to claim the throne.
But it's the physical description that really anchored this for me. What does the name Oedipus actually mean in ancient Greek?
It translates literally to swollen foot, or, more accurately in the context of ancient medical terminology, swollen lower limbs or swollen thighs.
Exactly. And then you look at the statues of Akhenaten that he himself commissioned. He mandated a radical new art style, the Amarna style, which depicted the royal family with shocking realism, completely breaking from traditional, idealized Egyptian forms.
And in every single statue.
Akhenaten is depicted with a highly unusual, almost grotesque physique. He has a sunken chest, a protruding, sagging stomach, an elongated face, and massive, swollen, deformed thighs and hips.
It's unmistakable.
Medical historians have argued for decades that he suffered from some sort of rare endocrine disease, Marfan syndrome, or a severe genetic disorder resulting from generations of royal incest. His thighs were literally swollen. Oedipus is Akhenaten. The physical deformity matches the mythological name perfectly.
It is a profound and unsettling connection. But the tragedy doesn't end with the king's physical ailments or his well-documented incestuous marriages, which mirror Oedipus marrying his mother, Jocasta.
Right.
The true tragedy is what happens to the state. In the Greek myth, Oedipus is eventually deposed in disgrace, and his two sons, Eteocles and Polynices, agree to share power in Thebes.
But it doesn't go well.
No. The power sharing fails, and they end up fighting a brutal, fratricidal civil war, ultimately killing each other in single combat at the gates of the city.
And what does the archaeological and historical record say happened in Egypt immediately after Akhenaten died or was deposed?
The historical record shows that Akhenaten was succeeded by two young, closely related kings, Smenkhkar and the famous boy king, Tutankhamun.
King Tut.
Yes. And just like the mythical brothers fought for control of Greek Thebes, the evidence strongly suggests that Smenkhkar and Tutankhamun's factions fought a bitter, destructive civil war for control of Egyptian Thebes and the legacy of the empire. The succession period is chaotic, violent, and highly fragmented.
And lurking in the shadows of the Greek myth is the character of Creon, the elder statesman, the calculating uncle who manipulates the young kings and eventually seizes the throne for himself once they are dead. Who is the historical Creon in this Egyptian drama?
The historical equivalent is a man named Ai. Yes. Ai was an elderly vizier, a deeply entrenched, powerful courtier who had served under Akhenaten and Amenhotep III. When the young king Tutankhamun dies suddenly and mysteriously, and many historians suspect he was assassinated or died of neglected injuries, Ai immediately usurps the throne.
That's like Creon.
Exactly. And he legitimizes his rule in the exact same manner a usurper does in a Greek tragedy, by forcing a marriage upon Tutankhamun's young, desperate, grieving widow, Enkisenamun. The historical machinations of Ai perfectly mirror the mythological treachery of Creon.
It is chilling how perfectly the political narrative aligns with the poetry. Oh, and I have to mention the Sphinx. The source briefly touches on the origin of the Sphinx in this specific context.
Oh, yes.
In the Oedipus myth, the Sphinx is a terrifying monster that plagues the city of Thebes with death until Oedipus solves her riddle. What is the Sphinx hysterically, according to Sweeney?
Sweeney points out that the Sphinx is not a Greek invention. It is a profound Egyptian symbol. Specifically, it often represented the fierce Egyptian lioness goddess Sekhmet.
The bringer of disease, right?
Exactly. Sekhmet symbolized cosmic destruction, divine retribution, and plague. During Akhenaten's reign, the Amarna letters and other regional records indicate that a massive, devastating pandemic, a literal plague, swept through the Middle East, Canaan, and into Egypt.
So a real plague.
Yes, killing off vast swaths of the population, including members of the royal family. The terror of the Sphinx in the Greek myth is the garbled cultural memory of this literal historical plague and the cosmic destruction of the Amarna civil war.
But the civil war isn't just an internal family dispute. It invites external disaster. The Oedipus myth cycle features the epic story of the Seven against Thebes, where one of the warring brothers brings a massive foreign coalition army to besiege his own city.
Yes, and this is where Sweeney brings in the hard historical documentation to anchor the myth. The Seven against Thebes represents a real historical, devastating invasion of Egypt.
By who?
Egyptian records from the chaotic period immediately following Akhenaten describe devastating incursions by foreign armies, which the Egyptian scribes refer to disparagingly as the polluted wretches or the Asiatics.
So who were these invaders capitalizing on Egypt's weakness?
Under the revised timeline, they were a coalition of Asian and Assyrian armies. The weakened Egyptian state, paralyzed by Akhenaten's religious fanaticism, the subsequent plague, and the fratricidal civil war, was easy prey for the rising powers of the Iron Age.
It was a perfect storm.
It was. And the man who finally ends the chaos, the military strongman General Horemheb, doesn't do it alone. The historical records and his subsequent administrative policies suggest Horemheb eventually stabilized the country and took absolute power with Asian backing. He made a deal with the invaders.
So the new Egyptian regime is essentially a puppet state, or at least heavily beholden to foreign powers from the north.
Exactly, and this marks a massive, irreversible cultural shift in ancient Egypt. Horemheb and the subsequent rulers bring foreign gods into the Egyptian pantheon, and Asian influence becomes deeply ingrained in the Egyptian military and administration.
So the Golden Age is over.
Yes. The glorious 18th dynasty ends not just in civil war, but in humiliating foreign subjugation. And Sweeney provides the final, elegant chronological lock here. He explains that the rise of the incredibly powerful Assyrian king Shalmaneser III, a known, firmly dated Iron Age conqueror, perfectly aligns with the end of Akhenaten's reign in the revised timeline.
Wow.
The geopolitical power vacuum created by the internal collapse of Egyptian Thebes is immediately filled by the rising Assyrian Empire, exactly as the revised chronology predicts.
It is a breathtaking synthesis of myth, archaeology, and geopolitics. But we know Egypt doesn't just vanish from the map of history after this humiliation. That brings us to chapter 6 and 7 and the epilogue of the book, which focus on the aftermath of this chaos. How does a civilization recover from the plague, the polluted wretches, and the total collapse of their ruling dynasty?
Well, they recover through sheer military willpower and the establishment of a robust new dynasty, the 19th dynasty. This period initiates what historians call the Egyptian Renaissance. And the key figures driving this resurgence are the militaristic Pharaoh Seti Surg and his incredibly famous, long-lived son, Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great.
Now, this is crucial. Under the standard timeline, Ramses II is fighting the Bronze Age Hittite Empire at the famous Battle of Kadesh, a different Kadesh in Syria. But under the revised timeline, the Bronze Age is long gone, so who are Seti I and Ramses II actually fighting?
This is where Sweeney's meticulous realignment of the records pays off. Sweeney details how, in this new Iron Age chronological framework, Ramses II's massive military campaigns into the Levant were not against an ancient, forgotten Bronze Age Hittite empire.
Who are they again?
Instead, his campaigns were focused on securing the borders of the now-established kingdoms of Israel and Judah and battling for control of the lucrative Syrian trade routes against the major known Iron Age powers.
So he's fighting the Neo-Assyrians.
Yes, Ramses II is fighting for control of the region against the Neo-Assyrians and the emerging Chaldean influence from Babylon. Ramses II is essentially trying to reestablish the lost imperial glory of Thutmose III, but he is doing it in a much later, much more contested, and highly militarized geopolitical landscape.
The source touches extensively on this wider world in Chapter 6. It talks about the specific Asian context that is required to make this timeline work. It mentions the Medes, the Chaldean Empire, and specific Mesopotamian kings like Adad-Nirari III and Shamshi-Adad IV. How does Sweeney connect Ramses to these specific individuals?
Well, to prove the timeline shift is valid, Sweeney has to show that the enemies, allies, and vassals recorded by the 19th dynasty pharaohs match the firmly established records of the Iron Age powers of Mesopotamia. And he does.
Really, he matches them up.
He goes through the diplomatic correspondence and military campaign logs of Seti asserting Ramses II and systematically aligns them with the reigns of specific Assyrian and Babylonian kings. For example, the border skirmishes and shifting alliances described in Seti Resurser's records perfectly describe the volatile politics of the 9th and 8th centuries BC, involving kings like Adad-Nirari III.
That's incredible.
Sweeney also reevaluates the Hittites that Ramses fought. He argues these were not the unified Bronze Age Empire, but the fragmented Neo-Hittite states located around Carchemish in northern Syria, which we know existed during the Iron Age. He demonstrates that the Egyptian records, when read without the bias of the conventional timeline, reflect the gritty realities of Iron Age geopolitics, not a mythical Bronze Age static world.
It's like retuning a radio dial. Suddenly all the static disappears, and the voices from Egypt, Israel, and Assyria are all speaking in the same era, interacting with each other.
It's a perfect analogy.
And the book caps off with an epilogue that shows how this chronological ripple effect doesn't just stop in the Middle East, it washes all the way over to the classical world, right? It mentions figures like Croesus, the famously wealthy king of Lydia, and his predecessor, Eliades.
Exactly. Sweeney recognizes that if you move the massive anchor of Egyptian history forward by 800 years, it pulls everything else in the Mediterranean basin with it.
Everything shifts.
The dark ages of Anatolia, the hazy early history of Lydia, and the chronological gaps in early Greece all have to be adjusted. In the epilogue, he demonstrates how this revised timeline smoothly connects the twilight of the Egyptian New Kingdom with the beginning of reliable, cross-referenced classical history.
So it fixes the Greek gaps, too.
Yes. By pulling Egypt forward, it suddenly aligns perfectly with the known interactions of Greek and Lydian figures like Croesus, showing that the chronological compression works flawlessly across the entire ancient Mediterranean world. It eliminates the Dark Ages universally.
It is an overwhelming amount of information to take in, and it fundamentally rearranges the furniture of the ancient world. You can never look at a museum exhibit the same way again.
You really can't.
So what does this all mean? Here is a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up. We've just spent this time discussing how the ancient Greeks were apparently writing down actual gritty Egyptian political history plagues, brutal civil wars, deformed kings, usurping uncles, and calling it mythology.
Right.
They turned the very real tragedy of Akhenaton into the myth of Oedipus. They compressed generations of great pharaohs into the superhero archetype of Sesostris. If that is true, if the timeline really is that compressed and these cultures were interacting that closely, how many other myths and legends that we take for granted as fanciful fairy tales are actually just garbled history from neighboring cultures?
It's a massive question.
What other historical figures are hiding in plain sight inside our books of mythology, just waiting for the timeline to be corrected so they can finally be decoded?
It is a profound realization. It raises an important question about how we receive and categorize knowledge. We have this modern arrogance that assumes the labels myth and history are mutually exclusive categories.
Very true.
Sweeney's work reminds us that history is often written by the confused, the culturally distant, and the poetic. When you align the timeline correctly, the myth dissolves, and the startlingly real human history remains.
It really does. Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We started by talking about how history usually feels like concrete or a clean binary X-ray.
Right.
But Sweeney shows us that when you look closely, when you challenge the foundational assumptions, the timeline is fluid, and the muddy waters of ancient chronology hide some of the most incredible secrets of the human story. I want to explicitly thank you, our audience, for wading into those muddy waters with us, for your time and for your curiosity today.
Yes, thank you for joining us on this highly complex, paradigm-shifting journey.
We truly appreciate your interaction in the comments, your insightful questions, and your sharing of this content with others who love history as much as we do. It means the world to us and helps the show grow. If you enjoyed having your historical assumptions challenged today, we warmly invite you to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating texts. Until next time, keep questioning the timeline, and don't assume the concrete has set.
Keep questioning the timeline. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this really comforting expectation of precision.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they take an X-ray, and it shows that jagged white line on the radius bone.
Right. It's undeniable.
Exactly. And the doctor just points at it. Broken. Not broken. It's binary. It's clean. And honestly, I mean, it's deeply reassuring.
We definitely want things to be that visible.
We desperately want them to be easily categorized. But then, you step into fields like neurodevelopment or trauma, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Right. It's heavily reliant on interpretation. It's full of hidden variables. And what is genuinely terrifying to me is that this exact same illusion of precision exists in our history books.
Oh, without a doubt.
I mean, we look at a timeline printed in a university textbook, and we treat it like an X-ray of the past. Year X happened, then year Y happened, a nice, neat, linear progression.
It looks so official printed on the page.
Right. Right. But what if the machine taking that X-ray has been structurally broken for, I don't know, 2,000 years?
That is the big question.
So welcome to this deep dive for the English BookCast. Today, we are taking on a massive, just a massive chronological puzzle.
It really is.
We are going to explore the horrifying possibility that hundreds of years of human history, entire centuries, might have been completely fabricated by ancient misunderstandings and then just cemented by modern confirmation bias.
Yeah, and the premise here challenges the very bedrock of antiquity. We are pulling apart Emmet Sweeney's The Ramessides, Medes, and Persians, which is volume 4 in his Ages in Alignment series.
Right.
And Sweeney's core argument really targets something historians call the centuries of darkness.
The centuries of darkness, which sounds like a fantasy novel, but it's a real academic term.
It is, because if you glance at the accepted chronology of the ancient Near East, it is just plagued by these bizarre, inexplicable dark ages. You have these incredibly vibrant, technologically advanced civilizations that seemingly just, forget how to build monuments.
They just forget.
Yeah. They forget how to write, how to engineer, how to create art. And then a few hundred years later, they miraculously remember those exact same skills.
Oh, wow.
Picking up right where they left off, as if no time had passed at all.
See, you look at that as a layperson, right? And you think, sure, okay, empires fall, people lose knowledge.
Sure.
But a civilization entirely forgetting how to, stack stones in an arch for 1,000 years, it feels off.
It feels off because the physical evidence contradicts it. I mean, this entire reevaluation really began with Immanuel Velikovsky in the mid-20th century.
Right, Velikovsky.
Yeah, he was looking at Egyptian history and realized that if you simply physically shift the Egyptian timeline, just pull it forward, sudden, almost miraculous synchronies appear with other surrounding cultures.
Okay, so just shifting the calendar.
Right. But the problem was, Velikovsky was stubbornly anchored to the traditional biblical chronology.
Oh.
He absolutely refused to move the Hebrew timelines. It was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, but refusing to turn one specific side.
Right, you're never going to get it.
Exactly. So the real breakthrough came later with Gunnar Heinsohn, a German professor who made a radical adjustment.
What did he do?
Heinsohn argued that all literate civilizations, including the biblical ones, belong in the first millennium BC.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And once Sweeney applied Heinsohn's theory to Velikovsky's initial observations, the puzzle pieces didn't just fit. They locked together with terrifying precision.
Okay, I need to wrap my head around how a mistake of this magnitude even happens.
It's a lot to take in.
Because if you are telling me that these ancient peoples didn't actually forget their technology, that means the Dark Ages aren't real time periods.
Exactly.
They are just empty spaces on a calendar. So, Imagine historians in the future finding a 21st century smartphone, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
Buried directly underneath a layer of Victorian horse carriages. And instead of realizing their dating system is just wrong, they decide there must be a 500-year dark age of zero technology between them.
Yes.
It's like a CEO wanting a company to look more established, so they commit accounting fraud. They take a single deposit and record it in 3 different ledgers across 3 different decades.
That's a great way to look at it.
Suddenly, the company looks 100 years old instead of 10. Is that essentially what historians did to the ancient world?
The accounting fraud metaphor is remarkably accurate, though, the original motives were theological, not financial.
Geological accounting fraud.
Basically, yeah. To understand the mechanism of this error, we have to look at the early Christian chronicler Eusebius, writing in the 4th century A.D.
Okay, Eusebius.
Eusebius had a very specific agenda. He needed to validate the Old Testament timeline against fierce criticism from Greek and Roman scholars.
Because they claim their cultures were older. Right.
Exactly. Older and therefore more legitimate.
So he had a massive conflict of interest from day one.
An insurmountable one. Eusebius took the Egyptian king lists, compiled by a priest named Manetho, and the Mesopotamian histories compiled by a scholar named Berossus, and he forcefully synchronized them with the Bible.
He just forced them to fit.
Right. But because he didn't understand that these ancient sources often use different regional names for the exact same kings,
Oh, I see.
or that some dynasties ruled concurrently rather than sequentially, he just stretched everything out end to end.
He aligned them all up in a row.
Exactly. He effectively duplicated and triplicated history. He created ghost centuries to make the math work.
Give me an example of this triplication.
Well, Sweeney points out that the so-called Mitanni,
Right.
this mysterious second millennium people who worshipped Indo-Iranian gods and whose leaders used the distinct title Great King, they're actually just the Medes of the first millennium.
Wait, the Medes, as in the Medes and the Persians?
The very same.
You're kidding.
Nope. And the supposedly ancient Akkadians, whom textbooks often call the Old Assyrians, are just the imperial Assyrians of the 8th century.
So Eusebius and later historians literally took one group of people, gave them 2 different names based on different regional sources, and placed them centuries apart on the timeline.
That is exactly what happened.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of this illusion, and arguably the most famous pharaoh in human history, Ramses II,
Well, yeah.
Ozymandias. The guy with the colossal statues, the monumental architecture, the definitive ruler of the New Kingdom. Every museum plaque on Earth says Ramses II and his son, Merneptah, ruled in the 13th century BC.
That's the established fact, yes.
But Sweeney is proposing a 700-year shift. He is arguing Ramses II ruled in the 6th century BC.
And the evidence for this shift hinges on the enemies that brought the Egyptian 19th dynasty to its knees.
Okay, tell me about these enemies.
Traditional historians claim that during Pharaoh Merneptah's reign, Egypt was swarmed by a mysterious confederation of invaders known broadly as the Sea Peoples.
Right, the Sea People.
If you read a standard textbook, it will tell you these were likely Mycenaean Greeks, displaced by famine or war, wandering the Mediterranean looking for a new home.
But Sweeney looks at the actual artwork, right? The bas-reliefs at the Temple of Medinet Habu.
He does.
And the Egyptian artists, they were incredibly meticulous. They didn't just carve generic enemies. They recorded specific armor, facial hair, weaponry.
Very specific details.
And there's one specific invading tribe depicted called the Paraset. And the artists went out of their way to show them wearing these very distinct feathered crowns.
Which is the thread that unravels the whole sweater.
Right.
We have to ask ourselves, in the broader context of ancient warfare, who famously wore a feathered crown into battle.
It wasn't Bronze Age Greeks.
No, it was the Persians. Sweeney mounts a very aggressive argument that the Paraset depicted in these Egyptian reliefs are the regular troops of the Persian Great King.
And it isn't just the hats, is it? It's the weaponry.
Oh, the weaponry is crucial.
The reliefs show these Paraset carrying immensely long, straight, iron-slashing swords. I might not be a military historian, but a massive iron broadsword in the 13th century BC Bronze Age.
Highly problematic.
That's anachronistic. That is like watching a World War II documentary and seeing a soldier casually pulling out a modern laser-guided missile.
Exactly. Those swords were the standard defining weapon of the 6th century Persian military machine.
The metallurgy alone should have tipped off traditional archaeologists.
You would think so. You simply cannot have widespread use of long iron swords centuries before the Iron Age supposedly begins in that region.
Right.
This is where the double adjustment of the timeline becomes strictly necessary. The Egyptian timeline has been artificially stretched by about 700 years, while the biblical and Mesopotamian histories have been stretched by roughly 200 years.
I have to pause here because if I'm a listener or just someone who occasionally watches a History Channel documentary, the sheer scale of this mistake is, it's paralyzing.
It's massive.
We are talking about rewriting thousands of museum plaques across the globe. Whole careers, entire university departments are built on the 13th century dating of Ramses II.
Oh, their whole livelihoods.
To tell an Egyptologist who has spent 40 years studying the New Kingdom, hey, your entire chronological framework is off by 7 centuries, that is an institutional nightmare.
It is the ultimate paradigm shift, and academia historically resists paradigm shifts with extreme prejudice.
I can imagine.
When your tenure, your published books, and your funding rely on the established timeline, you don't dismantle it just because you find an iron sword where it shouldn't be.
What do you do instead?
You invent a convoluted theory to explain away the sword. You relegate the anomaly to a footnote.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. I see a massive logistical crash coming.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you take Ramses II and Merneptah and you violently yank them out of the 13th century and drop them into the 6th century, well, the 6th century is already occupied.
Yes, it is very crowded.
You have the mighty Assyrian kings. You have the Persian Empire expanding. If these people are suddenly ruling at the exact same time, they can't just exist in a vacuum.
No, they can't.
Wouldn't they crash into each other in the historical record? They have to
Right.
be interacting. They should be trading, fighting, marrying each other.
And that collision of empires is exactly what we find when we strip away the artificial centuries.
Really?
Yes. The end of the 19th dynasty in Egypt wasn't a quiet, localized decline. It was a chaotic, bloody intersection with the expanding superpowers of the Near East.
Okay, walk me through that.
Sweeney dives deeply into this by re-identifying the key players. Let's look at Pharaoh Merneptah. Sweeney aligns him perfectly with a pharaoh known to the Greek historian Herodotus as Apries.
Apries, the guy who faced a massive catastrophic rebellion.
Yes, Herodotus tells us Apries was overthrown by a commoner named Amasis.
Okay.
Now, if we look at the Egyptian records from the end of the 19th dynasty, we find a shadowy usurper who seizes the throne. His name is Amenmeses.
Amasis.
Right. Sweeney demonstrates that Amenmeses and Amasis are the exact same historical figure.
So Amasis, or Amenmeses, stages this coup, but his victory parade is incredibly short-lived.
Very short-lived.
Because almost immediately, Egypt is totally overwhelmed by foreign invaders.
Yes, and under the traditional timeline, this is where historians just throw up their hands and insert a massive, confusing gap.
They just leave a blank space.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They talk about the Libyan kings of the 22nd dynasty popping up out of nowhere.
Right, the Libyans.
But Sweeney argues these Libyans were actually Asiatic and Persian vassals. They were puppet kings explicitly installed by the Persian king Cambyses after he conquered Egypt.
Okay, so it was a classic imperial strategy.
Exactly. You don't just conquer a land and leave. You install loyal locals, or at least regional proxies, to collect taxes and maintain order.
But the geopolitical dynamic on the ground was incredibly fractured, wasn't it? The native Egyptians didn't just surrender.
No, they mounted a desperate resistance.
This is where the story gets so chaotic, it feels like a modern geopolitical thriller. You have these Persian overlords pulling the strings, but you also have native Egyptian pharaohs teaming up with Ethiopian or Nubian kings to fight them off.
Right, the 25th dynasty.
Yeah.
Traditional history places these Nubian kings, famous figures like Tirhaka and Shabaka, much later in the timeline.
But once you align it,
Once you align the chronology, they become direct contemporaries of the very last desperate rulers of the 19th dynasty, like Seti II and Siptah.
oh, so they're all right there at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were all occupying the same historical space, forming these frantic alliances, battling against Persian and Assyrian control simultaneously.
The standout character for me in this entire era is a guy known as the Kingmaker.
Ah, Bey.
Yes, his name was Bey. He literally held the power to appoint Siptah to the throne of Egypt. But the Egyptian records are very clear about him, right? Bey was not Egyptian.
No, he wasn't.
He was an Asiatic overlord who wielded unprecedented, almost sickening levels of power over the pharaoh. I mean, imagine the sheer audacity. This foreign official was granted permission to build his own personal tomb in the Valley of the Kings.
Which is just unheard of. To put that in perspective for the listener, the Valley of the Kings was the most sacred, exclusive real estate in the ancient world.
Yeah.
It was strictly reserved for the divine rulers of Egypt. For a foreigner, an Asiatic chancellor, to card his tomb among the gods signifies an absolute collapse of Egyptian sovereignty.
It means the pharaoh was nothing more than a rubber stamp.
Exactly. And Sweeney identifies this kingmaker bey as Achaemenes, the Persian satrap, the regional governor appointed by Xerxes.
It is a profound realization, and it really contextualizes the rebellion of Seti II, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Sweeney identifies Seti II with a famous rebel leader known in other histories as Inaros.
Inaros fought against the great king, right?
Right. He fought a bitter, protracted war against the great king, specifically Sennacherib. And anticipating where we are heading later, Sweeney's research identifies Sennacherib as Xerxes.
The puzzle pieces just snap together with this audible click. There is this one piece of evidence that I just couldn't stop thinking about.
Which one?
It involves the Assyrian king Esarhaddon.
Oh, the annals.
Yeah, in his military annals, he records his successful conquest of the Egyptian capital, Memphis, and in his bragging, he specifically mentions capturing a settlement he calls Ishupri, which translates directly to Sethosville, or the town of Seti.
The implications of that single word are staggering.
Because of the timeline gap, right?
Exactly. Traditional chronology dictates a massive 500-year void between Pharaoh Seti II and the Assyrian king Esarhaddon.
500 years.
Right. So Egyptologists and Assyriologists have agonized for decades over this text. They're trying to figure out why a conquering Assyrian king would bother naming a captured town after an obscure minor pharaoh from half a millennium earlier.
It makes no military or political sense. Hey, everyone, I just conquered a town built by a guy you've never heard of from 500 years ago.
It's ridiculous. But if you wipe out the 500-year gap, the confusion just vanishes.
Because they're contemporaries.
Exactly. Esarhaddon is bragging about capturing a town that was built by his immediate contemporary, his current rival, Seti II.
It moves from an inexplicable historical anomaly to a perfectly logical military boast.
It does.
To really grasp what this foreign subjugation felt like for an everyday Egyptian, Sweeney brings up the story of Wainamoinen.
Such a great text.
It's this incredibly poignant ancient story. Wainamoinen is an Egyptian official, a priest who is sent on a diplomatic mission to Byblos in Lebanon to buy cedar wood to build a sacred barge for the god Amun.
Okay.
Under the old Egyptian empire, just a few centuries prior, an envoy of Amun would have been treated like absolute royalty. The locals would have fallen over themselves to supply the wood.
The Egyptian empire had historically dominated the Levant. Their word was law.
Right. But in this story, Wainamoinen arrives, and he is treated with total, unapologetic contempt.
It's a rude awakening.
He is robbed, he is mocked. The local prince basically laughs in his face and tells him to go sleep on the beach. He is reduced to begging. It is a story of profound national humiliation.
And traditional historians struggle to place it, often viewing it as a strained, isolated tale of decline.
But in Sweeney's aligned timeline...
In the aligned timeline, it is the defining reality of the era. Egypt was shattered. They were no longer the superpower dictating terms to the Near East. They were a broken, exploited vassal state under the thumb of the Neo-Assyrian or Persian Empire.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Think of Egypt at this time like a Cold War proxy state.
That's a good analogy.
You have a superpower, the Persians installing puppet kings and satraps like Bey. Meanwhile, the native Egyptian factions are frantically scrambling, making deals with Nubian warlords and hiring Greek mercenaries just to carve out a few miles of independent territory.
It is a chaotic, desperate geopolitical chessboard.
But this introduces a massive logistical problem, right?
It does.
If the Persians were pulling the strings and dominating Egypt right after the 19th dynasty fell, what on earth happened to the famous 20th dynasty?
Right, the dynasty of Ramses III, the guy who supposedly defeated the Sea Peoples. Where does he fit if the Persians are running the show?
Exactly.
Well, Sweeney relies heavily on Velikovsky's foundational research here to explain these ghost dynasties.
Okay.
According to the aligned timeline, the 20th dynasty didn't immediately follow the 19th at all.
There wasn't a smooth transition.
No smooth transition. Instead, there was a brutal 70-year gap of Persian occupation.
And Ramses III himself.
Velikovsky proposed, and Sweeney supports, that Ramses III is not a 12th century BC monarch. He is an alter ego of Nectanebo I, a pharaoh from the 30th dynasty.
Well, hold on, the 30th dynasty, that pushes him all the way into the 4th century BC.
It does. Nectanebo Search is historically celebrated for a very specific military achievement. He successfully repulsed a massive, overwhelming invasion by the Persian general Pharnabazus and his Greek mercenaries.
Oh.
Yes. So Sweeney argues that the epic, monumental reliefs of Ramses III fighting the Paraset at Medinet Habu are not depicting an ancient Bronze Age skirmish with wandering Mycenaeans.
They are depicting Nectanebo.
Right. They are contemporary, glorious depictions of Nectanebo fighting off Pharnabazus and the Persian military machine.
The feathered crowns. The iron swords. It's the Persians.
Yes.
It all comes back to that.
It does. And to reconcile the rest of the Egyptian timeline, the book argues that the 21st dynasty, which was an odd line of priest-kings ruling from Thebes,
Right. The priest kings.
they actually reigned during the 70-year Persian epoch. They weren't sequential, they were concurrent.
They were ruling at the same time.
Yes, they were local religious authorities trying to maintain some semblance of order while the Persians controlled the state apparatus.
I mean, I can hear the traditional Egyptologists screaming from here.
Oh, they definitely do scream about this.
And to be fair, they mount a very specific counter-argument. Sweeney addresses critics like John Bimson, who point directly to the genealogies of the ancient workmen.
Right, the village of Deir el-Medina.
Yes, the artisan village, the people who literally carved and painted the tombs in the Valley of the Kings.
Right.
Archaeologists have excavated their records, their legal disputes, their family trees. And the critics argue these genealogies prove an unbroken, continuous sequence from the 19th dynasty directly into the 20th dynasty.
No 70-year gap. No Persian occupation.
Right. So how does Sweeney handle that?
Well, their argument relies on the repetition of names. They find a record of a notorious criminal named Paneb working during the 19th dynasty.
Okay.
Then they find a record of a man named Khans, who is explicitly called the son of Paneb, working under Ramses III in the 20th dynasty.
And for traditional historians, that is case closed.
Right. Father in Dynasty 19, son in Dynasty 20. Therefore, the dynasties must be sequential.
It sounds like a smoking gun until you actually look at how ancient Egyptian language and culture operated.
Right.
Sweeney tears this apart as textbook circular reasoning. The traditional historians assume the timeline is continuous, so when they see these names, they force the relationship to fit.
They completely ignore the fact that in ancient Egyptian, the phrase son of often just meant descendant of.
Right. It could mean grandson or great-grandson. Furthermore, these artisan families reuse the exact same names for generations.
The methodology is just deeply flawed.
Wait, so historians see a guy named Khans in Dynasty 19 and a Khans in Dynasty 20 and assume they're father and son rather than just two guys with a common name separated by 70 years.
Yes.
That's like finding a census record of a guy named John Smith working as a mechanic in London in 1920.
Okay.
And then you find a work order for a John Smith fixing a car in 1990, and you assume the 1990 guy must be the direct, immediate son, ignoring the whole Cold War in between.
It's absurd.
You would have to invent impossibly long 100-year lifespans for these mechanics just to make your timeline work.
And that is precisely the trap traditional historians have fallen into at Deir el-Medina. They are artificially stretching human lifespans to hide a chronological gap.
Wow.
And Sweeney points to other textual evidence from this exact period that strongly suggests foreign occupation.
Oh, you mean the tomb robberies?
The Salt Papyrus.
Yes.
It is a fascinating legal document detailing rampant tomb robbery in the Theban necropolis.
Because things were falling apart.
Right. But the crucial detail is who is supposedly keeping order. The papyrus notes that barbarian troops are acting as the police force in Thebes.
Which makes no sense under the traditional timeline. Why on earth would the sacred religious capital of the Egyptian empire be policed by foreign barbarians?
Exactly.
Unless, of course, the country was shattered and under foreign occupation, the native government had collapsed.
The texts point to subjugation. But, texts can be debated, words can be reinterpreted. If we are going to dismantle a 2,000-year-old chronological framework, we cannot just rely on papyrus and king lists. The ultimate unbiased judge of history is the physical earth itself.
The dirt doesn't lie.
It really doesn't.
Which brings us to the archaeological impossibilities of the accepted timeline. If Eusebius and modern historians invented hundreds of years of ghost centuries, the physical layers of dirt should reflect that empty space.
This revolves around the science of stratigraphy. In archaeology, stratigraphy is the bedrock principle.
Okay, break that down for us.
It is the study of rock layers and layering. The basic law is superposition. The
Yeah.
deeper you dig, the older the material should be.
Makes sense.
And crucially, artifacts found sitting next to each other in the exact same undisturbed layer of dirt must belong to the exact same time period.
It is the ultimate reality check.
Right. But according to Sweeney's analysis, the actual dirt completely embarrassingly contradicts the textbook timelines.
Give me an example.
Let's look at the stratigraphy in Israel. At major excavation sites like Gezer and Lachish, archaeologists have dug down and found late Bronze Age material stuff that their textbooks say belongs in the 12th century BC.
Okay, 12th century.
But sitting right next to it, in the exact same stratum, they find iron scale armor. And not just any armor, but armor that is definitively Sargonid. It belongs to the imperial Assyrian armies of the 8th or 7th century BC.
The cognitive dissonance this creates for a traditional archaeologist must be immense.
No, it is. They're holding a piece of pottery they believe is from 1200 BC and a piece of armor they believe is from 700 BC, and they were buried at the exact same moment.
So what do? Instead of questioning the timeline that separates these objects by 500 years, the academic establishment invents convenient fictions.
The heirloom excuse.
Yes, the heirloom excuse.
They argue that the 12th century pottery was simply kept as a treasured family heirloom for 20 generations, carefully passed down from father to son for half a millennium, only to be casually dropped in the mud during a 7th century Assyrian siege.
It is laughable. A ceramic pot surviving 20 generations of warfare and relocation just to end up in the trash at the exact moment the Assyrians arrived.
That's highly unlikely.
And it's not just one pot. These anomalies are everywhere. Look at the so-called Neo-Hittites in Syria and Anatolia.
The Hittite anomaly is a perfect example of a fabricated Dark Age.
Walk us through that.
Traditional history tells us that the great Hittite Empire fell, disappearing entirely. Then, for hundreds of years, there's an Anatolian Dark Age, where supposedly nothing happens.
No building, no writing.
Right, and then suddenly, centuries later, Neo-Hittite city-states spring up, utilizing the exact same art styles, the exact same architecture, and the exact same hieroglyphic script.
Which is just too convenient. Sweeney argues this Anatolian Dark Age is a complete illusion, right?
Absolutely. The Hittite Empire material is found right alongside Neo-Hittite material in the dirt because they are the same people living at the exact same time.
There was no gap where they forgot how to carve stone.
No gap. Sweeney identifies these Neo-Hittites as the Lydians. The 500-year gap only exists on paper.
But perhaps the most visually shocking example of this stratigraphic nightmare comes from the Encomi tombs in Cyprus.
Oh, the British Museum expedition.
Yes.
Led by A.S. Murray.
Tell us about that, because that story is wild.
So they open these untouched, pristine tombs, they brush away the dust, and inside they find an impossible mix of artifacts.
What kind of mix?
They find 14th century Egyptian scarabs and jewelry lying side by side with 7th century Greek weaponry and pottery.
I try to imagine Murray's reactions standing in that tomb. He's a professional. He knows what he's looking at.
Right.
He sees an Egyptian artifact from the era of Akhenaten, and right next to it, a Greek sword from 700 years later. It must have felt like finding a Roman gladius buried inside a 1990s Honda Civic.
That's a perfect image. His brain must have been short-circuiting.
And Murray's initial instinct was correct, wasn't it?
It was. He documented the find and recognized that based on the physical evidence, the tombs had to be dated late, closer to the 7th century. He trusted the dirt.
But the establishment didn't like that.
Not at all. The Egyptology establishment came down on him like a ton of bricks. They absolutely refused to allow their 14th century Egyptian timeline to be shifted.
So what happened?
They essentially forced Murray to walk back his conclusions. The timeline was protected, but the cognitive dissonance remained unresolved.
It's not just pottery and swords, though. The thing that really exposed the absurdity of the traditional timeline for me is the technological anomalies.
Like glassmaking.
Yes. It is one thing to misplace a king. It is another to misplace an entire branch of chemical engineering. Sweeney brings up the core-formed glassmaking process.
It's a phenomenal example. Core-formed glassmaking is not a simple craft. It is a highly sophisticated, multi-step industrial process.
Okay, unpack that process for us.
We have to create a core made of a specific mixture of mud and sand. You coat that core in hot wax. You cast an outer mold around it.
Sounds complicated already.
It is. Then you carefully melt out the wax without disturbing the core, and then you slowly introduce molten glass, maintaining a precise temperature of around 1,000 degrees Celsius, wrapping threads of glass around the core.
Okay, let's unpack this. You're telling me a society invents a highly complex, multi-step chemical engineering process, entirely forgets it for almost a millennium, meaning dozens of generations pass,
Yes.
and then someone just happens to reinvent the exact same method.
That is what the traditional timeline demands you believe.
That's like saying the Romans invented the microchip, lost it, and Silicon Valley just coincidentally guessed the exact same circuitry.
It defies every known principle of technological progression.
It really does.
And it isn't isolated to glassmaking. Sweeney points out that the architectural arch, a fundamental breakthrough in engineering, was supposedly utilized by the Egyptians and Mesopotamians in the 3rd millennium BC.
Okay.
And then, according to the textbook timelines, humanity just forgot how to build an arch for 2,000 years before reinventing it in the 7th century BC.
Sorry, boss, we can't build the aqueduct. We forgot how curves work for the next 80 generations.
Exactly. When you adhere to the traditional chronology, you are forced to view ancient humanity as incredibly incompetent.
They're constantly inventing brilliant things, immediately forgetting them for a millennium, and then miraculously reinventing them.
But if we listen to the stratigraphy, if we look at the layers of dirt and compress the timeline, removing Eusebius's ghost centuries, all of these dark ages instantly vanish.
The technologies weren't forgotten. They were in continuous, unbroken use.
Unbroken.
But compressing the dirt forces a much more radical compression, doesn't it?
It does.
If the dirt proves that the 8th century Assyrians and the 6th century Persians are dropping their swords and their glass pots in the exact same layer of mud at the exact same time, they cannot both exist as separate empires.
No, they can't.
They are occupying the exact same slice of history, ruling the exact same geographic territory, which leads to the most mind-bending conclusion of the book.
The ultimate alter egos.
Yes. Sweeney argues that the late Neo-Assyrian kings, the terrifying conquerors you read about in the Old Testament and the Mesopotamian records, are the exact same human beings as the Persian Achaemenid great kings.
It is the greatest identity theft in historical record.
This is the crux of the second half of Sweeney's analysis, right?
Yes. He systematically goes through the rosters of these two supposedly distinct empires and pairs them up based on their actions, their wars, and their family dynamics.
Okay, let's walk through this alignment, because the parallels are too specific to be coincidence. First, Sweeney pairs Tiglath-Pileser III with Cyrus the Great.
The foundational conquerors. Both men built unprecedented empires from scratch. Both swept through the Levant in massive campaigns.
Right.
And crucially, both famously conquered Babylon, which was universally recognized as a watershed moment in ancient geopolitics.
Okay, next, the Assyrian king Sargon II is paired with the Persian king Darius I.
Again, the political footprint is identical. Sargon and Darius were both usurpers. They did not inherit the throne through a direct peaceful succession. They had to seize it and justify their rule.
They both had to fight for it.
Right. Both of them fought incredibly bitter, defining wars against the Ionian Greeks. Both claimed, in their monumental inscriptions, to rule a massive expanse stretching from Egypt all the way to the borders of India.
Wow.
And both of them were forced to suppress massive existential rebellions in Babylon at the very beginning of their reigns.
So the biographies match perfectly. But the one that absolutely hooked me, the parallel where the details get granular, is Sennacherib and Xerxes.
Oh, this one is amazing.
Sweeney argues the Assyrian Sennacherib and the Persian Xerxes are the exact same man.
The Sennacherib-Xerxes parallel is arguably the strongest evidence in the entire book. It goes far beyond general military conquest into specific documented behavior.
Let's look at the timeline of their reigns.
Both kings launched massive wars against Egypt very early in their tenure, specifically in their second or third year on the throne. Both fought catastrophic, legendary wars against the Greeks.
And the Babylonian problem. Babylon was the thorn in both of their sides.
A massive thorn.
Sweeney highlights that both Sennacherib and Xerxes had to suppress exactly 2 Babylonian rebellions. Not 1, not 3, exactly 2.
Exactly 2.
And the names of the rebel leaders in the ancient texts are shockingly similar. Sennacherib fought a rebel named Belibni. Xerxes fought a rebel named Belshammani.
Linguistic variations of the exact same Babylonian name. And look at how the king reacted.
How did they react?
After the first rebellion, both Sennacherib and Xerxes were remarkably lenient. They tried to integrate Babylon. But after the second rebellion, the leniency vanished.
They hadn't.
Both kings, in a furious rage, utterly destroyed Babylon. They tore down the city walls, they desecrated the sacred temples, and they carried off the statue of the god Marduk.
So the psychological profile is a match. But it's the assassination that sealed it for me. You can fake a military campaign, but you can't fake this level of domestic tragedy.
The assassination details are chilling.
Both Sennacherib and Xerxes were murdered in a palace plot, but the details are what matter. They were both murdered specifically by their eldest son, who had been passed over and was not the designated crown prince. And in both histories, that murderous eldest son was immediately hunted down and killed by a younger brother, who then rightfully took the throne.
The succession crisis is identical. For the Assyrian Sennacherib, the avenging younger son who took the throne was Esarhaddon.
Okay.
For the Persian Xerxes, the avenging younger son was Artaxerxes I. Therefore, by the irrefutable logic of the timeline, Esarhaddon must be Artaxerxes I.
It just perfectly overlays, and it keeps going. The famous scholar king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal, is identified as Darius II.
The lineage maps perfectly over itself once the ghost centuries are removed.
I am tracking with the logic, but I have to play devil's advocate here. I am stepping into the shoes of the skeptical listener.
Okay, let's hear the skepticism.
I understand the timelines match, but why would they use different names?
Ah.
If I am Cyrus the Great, I have just conquered the known world. I have an ego the size of a mountain. I want everyone from Egypt to India to know that I, Cyrus, am their ruler.
Naturally.
Why on earth would I suddenly start calling myself Tiglath-Pileser the moment I cross the border into Babylon?
It is an excellent necessary question, and the answer lies in understanding ancient propaganda and theology. The ancient Near East was not a secular society. The right to rule was explicitly granted by local deities.
Okay.
If you are an Iranian, Persian-speaking king, and you march into Mesopotamia, a deeply religious, ancient Semitic-speaking culture, you cannot simply impose your foreign identity on them.
Because they'll reject you.
Exactly. You are an outsider, an infidel. To be recognized as a legitimate ruler by the powerful local priesthoods, and more importantly by the local gods, you had to adopt a localized, religiously significant throne name.
So it's a political masquerade?
Precisely. Tiglath-Pileser isn't just a random name. It is a profound theological statement in the Assyrian language.
What does it mean?
It translates roughly to, "My trust is in the heir of Esherah," invoking the chief Assyrian god Ashur. The great kings understood that to rule a polyglot empire, they had to wear different masks in different regions.
I see.
They used different throne names to maintain theological legitimacy and prevent constant religious uprisings.
That actually makes total sense. We see this today. A politician campaigning in Texas uses completely different rhetoric, a different tone, and sometimes even a different accent than when they are campaigning in New York.
That's a perfect modern equivalent.
They adapt to the local culture to gain votes. The Persian kings were just doing the ancient theological version of that to prevent rebellions.
It was a survival strategy, and the theology itself supports this merger. Sweeney notes that the supreme deity of the Persians, Ahura Mazda, is culturally, functionally, and artistically identical to the supreme deity of the Assyrians, Ashur.
They use the exact same logo.
The winged disc.
Right.
If you look at a Persian relief of Ahura Mazda and an Assyrian relief of Ashur, they are indistinguishable.
Right.
Sweeney's argument is that there are not two different gods. They are the exact same deity, simply pronounced and venerated differently by the Persian and Assyrian populations.
So if the Neo-Assyrian war machine was actually just the Persian Empire operating under local aliases, this theory doesn't just rewrite Mesopotamian history.
No, it goes much further.
It completely detonates the history of Babylon, and arguably, more importantly for Western history, it upends the entire biblical narrative.
Which brings us to a massive consequence of this theory, the Babylonian mix-up and the resulting biblical void.
Right.
If the mighty Neo-Assyrians are actually the early Persian kings, then who are the Neo-Babylonians?
Right. The Neo-Babylonians. The empire of Nebuchadnezzar, the guys who besieged Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and dragged the Jewish people into the famous Babylonian exile. Where do they fit?
Sweeney demonstrates that the Neo-Babylonian Empire is not a separate entity preceding the Persians. It is actually the late Persian Empire.
Yeah, late Persians.
Yes, it represents the kings who ruled after Darius II.
So Nebuchadnezzar II, arguably the most famous villain in the Old Testament, this legendary, cruel conqueror, who is he in the Persian timeline?
And Nebuchadnezzar II aligns perfectly with the Persian king Artaxerxes III.
Artaxerxes III.
The historical footprints match exactly. Both were notoriously brutal, uncompromising rulers, Both launched massive, successful military campaigns, pushing all the way to the borders of Egypt.
And the biblical connection.
Most importantly for the biblical narrative, both besieged Jerusalem, subdued the local population, and installed client kings to enforce their will.
But the real chaos, the thing that broke the timeline, centers around a king named Nabonidus. I found this part of the book absolutely fascinating because it explains how a simple clerical error can erase centuries of history.
The double Nabonidus scenario.
Yeah, Sweeney claims there wasn't just one Nabonidus. There were two kings with that name, separated by 200 years.
And this double Nabonidus scenario is the smoking gun for how the timeline became so corrupted.
Walk us through the two kings.
Nabonidusite was the Babylonian ruler conquered by Cyrus the Great at the very inception of the Persian Empire. But there was a second Nabonidus II, who was also known in Greek histories as Darius III.
The guy who fought Alexander the Great.
Exactly. He was the very last Persian king, and he was the one conquered by Alexander.
So you have Nabonidus #1 falling to the Persians, and Nabonidus #2 falling to the Greeks 2 centuries later.
Exactly. And this is where we have to look at the mechanism of history. How were these records compiled?
Wait, they didn't have the internet.
Right. During the Hellenistic era, after Alexander the Great, Jewish scribes and historians were trying to piece together the history of their people. They were gathering regional records, written in different languages, using different dating systems and different localized king names.
They were trying to build a master spreadsheet from a dozen different conflicting sources.
And they made a catastrophic error.
What did they do?
They saw records of a Babylonian king named Nabonidus being conquered, and they saw records of a liberation of the Jewish people. But they conflated Nabonidus II with Nabonidus II.
They thought they were the same guy.
Yes. They confused the dawn of the Persian Empire with the fall of the Persian Empire. In doing so, they essentially folded the timeline in on itself, collapsing 2 centuries of history.
They created a massive void. If you read the Old Testament chronologically, you go from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then suddenly there's this gaping 250-year black hole where absolutely nothing happens before you pick up the story again in the books of the Maccabees.
A total void.
The scribes literally lost 250 years of their own history because they mixed up the paperwork.
The implications for biblical scholarship are profound.
It changes the entire narrative of the liberation.
It does.
So what does this all mean? The traditional story is that Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon and graciously freed the Jewish captives. But if Sweeney is right, and the timeline is shifted, the Jewish captives weren't freed by Cyrus, they were freed by Alexander the Great.
That's the logical conclusion.
The scribes literally gave the credit to the wrong empire because the paperwork got mixed up centuries later.
Sweeney provides incredibly compelling textual evidence for this chronological confusion by looking at the Apocrypha, specifically the Book of Judith.
Okay, let's talk about the Book of Judith because the names here are impossible to ignore.
The Book of Judith is a historical text that has always baffled theologians because its timeline seems completely incoherent. It features Nebuchadnezzar, but strangely refers to him as the king of Assyria, not Babylon. And more importantly, it names his top military general as Holofernes and his most trusted court eunuch as Bagoas.
Which would be fine, except those names don't belong in that era.
They absolutely do not.
Okay.
Holofernes and Bagoas are the exact historically documented names of the military general and the chief eunuch who served the late Persian king Artaxerxes III.
Wow.
These are distinctly Persian names, serving in a distinctly Persian court, yet the biblical text places them under Nebuchadnezzar.
It's the ultimate anachronism. It's like finding an official government document that says Abraham Lincoln ordered his Vice President Kamala Harris to draft a law.
Great comparison.
The moment you read it, you know the author has taken 2 completely different eras and smashed them together. The Book of Judith proves that the ancient scribes were mixing up the Neo-Babylonians and the late Persians. They were the same people.
The textual evidence of the mix-up is undeniable. But again, text can be debated.
Right, back to the dirt.
Exactly. If the Neo-Babylonians are truly the late Persians, then the physical dirt of Mesopotamia, the stratigraphy of Babylon itself, must reflect this reality.
And this brings us to the archaeological climax of the book, the disappearing Persians.
The disappearing Persians.
We talked earlier about the dirt in Israel and Cyprus causing problems, but the dirt in Mesopotamia is perhaps the most damning piece of evidence against the traditional timeline in existence.
Because from an archaeological standpoint, the Persian Empire in Mesopotamia practically does not exist,
Which sounds insane. The Persian Empire ruled the known world.
and Assyria and Babylon were the jewels in their crown.
Right.
Traditional historians will tell you that after the Medes destroyed the Assyrian capital, the entire region became a desolate, uninhabited wasteland.
But wait, didn't Herodotus say something different?
He absolutely did. This completely contradicts the primary ancient sources. Herodotus, the Greek historian who actually lived during this era, explicitly stated that Assyria was the wealthiest, most populous satrapy in the entire Persian Empire. It was the breadbasket. It provided a full third of all the tribute collected by the great king.
You don't collect a third of your global empire's wealth from a depopulated desert. There had to be massive cities, infrastructure, millions of people living and working there.
Exactly. But when modern archaeologists go to Assyria or Babylon and start digging, they cannot find the Persians.
They just aren't there.
There is a glaring, inexplicable absence of Persian material culture. The most famous example of this is Robert Koldewey's excavation at Babylon.
Let's visualize this dig. Koldewey is a meticulous, pioneering archaeologist. He is trenching down through the layers of the ancient city of Babylon.
He digs down and finds the Hellenistic layer. This is the debris, the pottery, the Greek artifacts left behind by Alexander the Great's soldiers and the subsequent Seleucid Empire.
Okay, the Greeks are there. So he digs deeper, expecting to find the Persian layer that came right before Alexander.
But he doesn't.
What does he find?
Directly underneath the Hellenistic layer, sitting intimately, physically right on top of it, is the Neo-Babylonian layer, the layer of Nebuchadnezzar.
There is zero Persian dirt between them.
None. Not a single layer of Persian architecture, no Persian pottery stratum separating the Greeks from the Babylonians.
Which means?
In the rigid laws of stratigraphy, if layer A sits directly on top of layer B with no sterile dirt or other cultural markers between them, then layer B immediately precedes layer A.
So Koldewey is standing in this trench. He finds Greek pottery resting directly on top of Neo-Babylonian bricks. And instead of following the scientific method and saying, wow, the Neo-Babylonian era must be the time period right before the Greeks arrived, he defaults to the established text.
He defers to the paper timeline.
He says, well, the texts say the Persians ruled here for 2 centuries, so I guess the Persians just didn't leave any trash, build any buildings, or drop any coins for 200 years. They were just invisible.
It is the pinnacle of confirmation bias. The archaeological establishment chose to believe a flawed paper timeline over the physical reality of the Earth.
It's astounding.
Sweeney's conclusion is beautifully simple, yet devastating. The reason Koldewey and subsequent archaeologists cannot find the Persians in Mesopotamia is because they are already holding them in their hands.
The Neo-Babylonian layer is the Persian layer.
They're just calling them by their local Mesopotamian names.
It is a stunning realization. But before we wrap up this grand unified theory, I have one lingering logical hurdle.
Okay, what is it?
If you are merging these kings, if Esarhaddon is Artaxerxes I, for instance, how do you reconcile the math of their reigns?
The reign lengths.
Yeah, Esarhaddon is recorded as ruling for 12 years. But Artaxerxes I is universally recorded as reigning for 40 years. You can change a name, but you can't just invent 28 years of ruling time. How can they be the same guy?
It's a crucial detail, and Sweeney addresses it by exploring how ancient cultures conceptualized and calculated time.
Yeah.
We view a reign purely politically, the day you take the throne to the day you die or abdicate.
Right.
But in ancient Babylon, the king was not just a politician. He was viewed as the living, physical incarnation of the supreme god Marduk.
A divine avatar.
Yes. And a god's reign on earth doesn't begin when they put a crown on his head. It begins the moment he is born.
Oh.
Sweeney argues that the 40-year figure for Artaxerxes III is not his political reign. It is his total lifespan. He lived for 40 years.
And the 12-year figure?
The 12-year figure recorded for Esarhaddon represents his actual active political reign over Babylon. The math perfectly reconciles when you understand the cultural definitions of time.
That is brilliant.
This is also why there are almost no physical archaeological remains or monuments attributed to a 40-year reign of Artaxerxes in Persia, because he didn't rule for 40 years. He was only active for a fraction of that time.
Different calendars, different theological definitions of reality. It makes you wonder how much of our history is just a translation error.
Probably more than we want to admit.
And just to tie up one final loose end, what about the old Babylonians? Where does Hammurabi, the guy with the famous code of laws, fit into this compressed timeline?
This is where Sweeney actually departs from some other historical revisionists. He looks strictly at the stratigraphy.
What does the dirt say?
Based on the physical layers, he places the Old Babylonians Hammurabi's people immediately preceding the Neo-Chaldeans.
Though?
But he identifies them not as Persians, but as Scythians or Gutians, who briefly swept down and controlled the region.
Okay, so he lets the dirt dictate the identity rather than trying to force-fit them into a Persian mold.
Exactly.
So, bringing all of this together, Velikovsky, with his Ages and Chaos, was a genius of character identification.
He was a pioneer.
He saw the psychological and biographical parallels. He saw that Ramses III was fighting Persians, not Greeks. But he was trapped by a stubborn adherence to an untouchable biblical chronology. He couldn't finish the puzzle.
Right.
But by applying Heinsohn's theory, shrinking the biblical timeline by 200 years and shifting the Egyptian timeline by 700 years, Sweeney makes the entire ancient world click into perfect logical alignment.
It resolves centuries of academic headaches in one stroke. The inexplicable Dark Ages disappear.
The jarring technological anomalies like the glass-making in the arches vanish.
The missing archaeological layers in Babylon are accounted for. The history of the ancient Near East transforms from a disjointed series of amnesiac empires into a continuous, vibrant, logical story of human development.
It is incredibly liberating to look at history this way. Dismantling these rigid, artificial timelines allows us to see these ancient peoples as they actually were interacting, trading, fighting, and evolving together, rather than being separated by ghost centuries invented by a 4th century chronicler.
It is deeply liberating, because knowledge is most valuable when it is rigorously tested and understood, not blindly accepted.
Absolutely.
This critical approach to history forces us to question our most fundamental assumptions. It reminds us of how fragile our constructed timelines truly are, and how easily human error can be codified into unquestionable truth.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Leave them with something big.
If the entire chronology of the ancient Near East, the cradle of civilization, could be fundamentally distorted for over 2 millennia simply because early historians tried to force-fit texts to match a specific religious agenda,
Right.
what other Dark Ages are we blindly accepting? Could the European Dark Ages following the fall of Rome, or the massive gaps in ancient Mesoamerican timelines, be suffering from the exact same institutional blind spots?
It's a terrifying yet necessary question.
How much of the history we accept as absolute fact is just the result of bad ancient bookkeeping and modern confirmation bias?
It is a question that challenges the very foundation of historical academia, and one that requires a fearless willingness to look at the dirt, rather than just the textbooks.
We want to thank you so much for joining this conversation today. Exploring these massive intellectual puzzles is what this deep dive is all about, and we truly appreciate the interaction, the comments, and the sharing from this amazing listener community.
We really do.
If you love dismantling the accepted narratives and looking for the hidden truths, please subscribe to the English BookCast for more deep dives.
We always encourage you to keep questioning and to look at the evidence with fresh eyes.
Because sometimes you look at that historical X-ray and you realize the machine isn't just showing you muddy waters. It was pointing at the completely wrong patient. Thanks for listening.